Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Redford, and I teach Islamic art and archaeology at SOAS, and also a member of council at the British Institute at Ankara. It's a great privilege and a pleasure for me to introduce you to this evening's lecturer. I have an echo here, Caroline Finkel. Caroline received her doctorate in SOAS in the 1980s at a date she will refuse to tell me just now. She studied Ottoman history at SOAS, where she received her doctorate. Her studies, as well as her marriage to journalist Andrew Finkel, took her to Turkey, where she took root in the Ottoman archives and in the intellectual and cultural life of Istanbul. Caroline's first book was on historic earthquakes in the Ottoman Empire.
That's the second.
Second book, excuse me. Another source of great interest, especially, of course, to the inhabitants of Istanbul. Caroline's one-volume history of the Ottoman Empire, Osman's Dream, first published in 2005, has been translated into 5 languages, still in print in Turkish and in English, right?
And Greek and Russian.
And Hungarian and etc. And turned her into a celebrity in Turkey. How many historians do you know whose books are sold in the Turkish equivalent of Sainsbury's?
That's true.
That's Migros, for those of you who know Turkey. When she and her husband came to visit me in Alanya on Turkey's southern coast, my friends heard the news and they all came to meet her with their copies of her book tucked under their arms. These are among them a dentist, a graphic artist, a hotel owner, a tour guide. She was the person that they all wanted to meet. Nobody else amongst the group. After her success of Osman's Dream, Caroline turned her wide-ranging interests to the question of the northern frontiers of the Ottoman Empire. She co-directed an innovative collaboration between British and Ukrainian scholars, historians and archaeologists, better to understand the history and organization of one of the great Ottoman fortresses on the northern Black Sea. Akkerman is the Turkish name for it, which controlled access to the Dniester River just to the west and south of Odessa. Caroline's restless intellect has always combined with a knowledge of Turkey and a love of its landscape and its people. What better match, then, for Caroline's restless temperament than the famous 17th century Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi? Caroline has studied and published scholarly articles on Evliya Çelebi, on his Seyahatname, or Book of Travels. But in 2009, she's going to correct me on the date of this as well, 2009, she joined a project organized to celebrate in 2011 the 400th anniversary of his birth. Now, could you imagine Caroline participating in this project? By taking part in a 6-week horseback riding tour through Western Anatolia, tracing Evliya Çelebi's travels 400 years previously, about 400 years. When soon after this epic expedition, I asked her very blithely how it had gone, she replied very succinctly, "Best fun," she said, "best fun I had since I was 17 and I hitchhiked to Afghanistan." But of course, the fun was incredibly rigorous, as was the scholarship. She was the researcher for historical geography, but also the culture and economics of Ottoman horse breeding, horse games that were played on horseback, and many other topics related to this amazing traveler and his travels. Caroline has returned to this route, the route through Western Anatolia, several times since, on foot, alone, and with university students from Bursa. This Seria Ludo, or serious fun, as the Society of Dilettanti called it, culminated in publication in 2011 of the book The Evliya Çelebi Way, Turkey's first long-distance walking and riding route, which Caroline co-authored with Kate Clow and Donna Landry. It is this research that informs the topic of tonight's lecture. So please join me in welcoming Caroline Finkel to talk on the subject of A Life on the Road, the Exploits and Adventures of the 17th Century Ottoman Traveler, Evliya Çelebi.
Well, thank you, Scott. The warm-up act is not meant to upstage the main event, and that was wonderfully florid. Thank you very much. And also has taken care of a few things in the lecture, which if I run out of time, you'll know already. And I'm very happy to see you all here because there are a lot of events going on tonight. My neighbours are here from our local AGM in Chiswick. This is where we could be, or they could be. And there's a food event at the Anglo-Turkish food, but you're not there either. And there's also, sadly, an event at SOAS on the trial of Selahattin Demirtas, the Kurdish leader. So I'm very happy to be here, retreating into time, going back into history, and also because the BIAA has not historically paid much attention to Ottoman history. They had a little sort of fillip a few years ago, but it hasn't been in any way much of their focus. So I'm going to talk about Evliya, whose life spans most of the Ottoman 17th century. He wrote his Seyahatname, or his Book of Travels, which at 10 large volumes like this, is considered the longest travel account in world literature. I haven't counted the pages, but this is certainly what is thought to be the case. So Evliya's travels are very familiar to people in the countries through which he traveled. I mean, there's the Albanian translation of the Albanian bit, the Russian translation of the Russian bit, the south of Russia, and so on. Croatia, done in Croatian. But people here don't know him so well. He's much less known in the English-speaking world. You may have read, hang on, let me get the hang of this, this Eland Press 2010 book, which has extracts from each of these 10 books and has made his work available for a modern readership. So if you do know something about Evliya already, then I hope this will fill in the background a bit. And if you don't, then maybe my talk will act as an introduction to the man and his work and his times. His Book of Travels, I will probably call it Seyahatname, which is what it was originally called, is very frequently cited by scholars, and it's quoted by those who have read it, and very much also by those who haven't read it. Even the Turkish taxi drivers have an opinion on it. Yet despite his name being common currency in Turkey, the flickering of serious interest in him that came up during the celebrations in 2011 for the 400th anniversary of his birth have not been translated into the visibility and appreciation that our own literary greats, or literary greats in many other places, enjoy. A couple of years ago, I launched a petition, a change.org petition, to try and have the new bridge over the Izmit Gulf named the Evliya Çelebi Bridge. It was to the president. There's a long tradition in Ottoman history of petitioners petitioning the powers that be, not the sultan, though the parallel has been made. And I pointed out that apart from him being such a great figure, that he had also travelled that route, albeit on the water below the bridge, several times during his life. Well, the president wasn't listening, of course. Obviously, there were other things going on in the White Palace that preoccupied him. Predictably enough, the bridge was called the Osman Gazi Bridge after the first sultan. Despite these setbacks, it's my mission and that of Donna Landry and Gerald MacLean, who Scott mentioned, Donna, to try and make Evliya be recognised as he deserves to be, including in his rather indifferent homeland. So just a quick word about the slide. The slide here, well, I had to sort of fashion the talk in the end around the slide because the BIAA, being a law-abiding institution, would not let me just put any old picture on there that didn't have copyright. Well, there are lots of pictures on the web of Evliya, and there are none contemporary, of course, but you'll notice they're all with beards, and I didn't have permission for them anyway. So it just shows that people aren't reading Evliya. I mean, he tells us once that he's been clean-shaven for 46 years, and he tells us at another point in his Seyahatname that the people he encountered, I can't remember at which point it was, could not believe that he was a Qadi, a judge, and a Ghazi, a warrior, because he was clean-shaven. So this just goes to show that there was an expectation both at that time and now, that an Ottoman gentleman have a beard. So pretty much everything we know about Evliya comes from his own writings, and as we know, autobiographies are notoriously unreliable. There are a few other clues. He tells us in the Seyahatname that he left graffiti around the place, not something we would encourage today, but that's what he did. He lists 30 in the Seyahatname, and 5 are known, and the 2 lists do not join up. This particular one is in Adana, on the door of a mosque. I haven't seen it. Have you seen any of them? No. Anyway, they are there to be seen. There's 2 in Foča on the Aegean coast, 1 in Kustendil in Bulgaria, and 1 in Karaman. And there's another possible one. He says he writes, he's the world traveller Evliya. He also tells us that he had a ring engraved, world traveller. The second document here, which mentions, oh my God, I did the right thing, but it vanished. Oop. Hang on. Okay. Is a patent of safe conduct given to him by the Patriarch of St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, probably when he was on his Hajj journey, on his pilgrimage journey. He clearly charmed the Patriarch, humble, honourable, a man of peace, blah, blah, blah. It couldn't be more kinder and more affectionate towards Evliya, if it tried, really. So that is a second document that mentions him. We have here an archery manual where his name appears. It's the 2 white squares, which are all 1 there and 1 there. The reds are just underlinings in the text. He was an archer, obviously. And here, his name appears, Evliya Effendi, in a list from the Viennese archives, of a delegation that went to Vienna in 1665 for peace talks. So we have these other mentions, but scholars have tried to find stuff about him in the chronicles, in other archives, and have failed. So we know he existed. He writes that he was born on the 25th of March, 1611 in Istanbul. In fact, he writes that he was born on the 10th day of Muharrem, in the year 1020 of the Islamic calendar. Well, you'll probably know that the 10th of Muharrem is a very sacred day for Muslims, and it's a day that anyone would, if they were a pious Muslim, writing later in retrospect, would choose to be born on. So, do we know? We don't know, definitely. His father was the Ottoman court's chief goldsmith, a man with illustrious ancestry that Evliya mentions quite frequently throughout his work. And his father came from Kütahya. His family came from Kütahya. Some of the local people there insist that Evliya was born in Kütahya, even though he tells us himself that he wasn't. His mother was from Abkhazia, which is just to the west of Georgia on the Black Sea, and a relative of a sometime Grand Vizier called Melik Ahmed Pasha, who also became Evliya's main patron during his travels. He was educated in the medrese and then in the palace school. He caught the eye of Sultan Murad IV, who's here going off to campaign in Baghdad in 1638. In fact, it's a posthumous miniature. Up here we can see, I can't read it from here, but it says the late Sultan Murad, so obviously it's done after he died. And he was chosen to be his boon companion. So that implies a great closeness to circles of power, and obviously his start in life was very privileged and auspicious. He had many persona. He was a linguist, a historian, a geographer, a musician, an archer, a muezzin, a composer of chronograms, a dervish, a devout Sunni Muslim, a cavalryman and a warrior, and a witty conversationalist, raconteur, and entertainer. Notably for our purposes, he was also a traveller, an adventurer, and a writer. He was almost 30 when he made his first trip away from Istanbul in 1640, soon after the death of the Sultan. He crept away to Bursa without informing his family and stayed there for some 7 weeks. He tells us he stayed there for 40 days. So again, he's invoking an auspicious number, and he does this, a significant number. He does this many times during his work, during the Seyahatname. Next, in 1640 to 42, he traveled to Crimea and Azov, and on his return, he was famously shipwrecked. He describes this terrifying incident with extraordinary exuberance. This is what engages his readers, and I strongly advise you to read it if you can get hold of the Eland volume, because it's in there, and it's a wonderful piece of writing. He did actually get on a boat again on his way to Mecca in 1671. His father apparently had been present at the siege of Cyprus in 1571, and Evliya obviously felt that he had to go there, so he got on a boat in Silifke, or to the west of Silifke. They were just setting off from the coast when they got attacked by 3 infidel ships, and they hightailed it back to the coast, and he never went on the sea again. So he was at home on land. Here's a typical sort of Han. He doesn't much say that he stayed in Hans, but he did on some occasions, obviously. He spent 40 years on the road, more or less. It's all a bit more or less, 40 again, the magic of the number 40. Traveling from Vienna on the one hand to Azov, the Sea of Azov, in the east, and far up the Nile. So he covered a huge area. Unfortunately, there's not really a decent map of it. I mean, it's such a large area. One could just have a map with none of the names on it. But I've never seen a satisfactory map. I'll show you a map later that encapsulates his Anatolian journeys, but then you'll see how difficult it is. He mostly traveled in the retinue of a statesman, such as Melik Ahmed Pasha, as a companion of their own class and education, who could be called upon to perform services, mundane stuff like tax collection, or prayer calling, or he could write chronograms also as required. Chronograms, you will know, are the last line of a poem, say that all the letters in the Arabic alphabet have values, and when you add up the letters used in this line, which has to rhyme, it has to adhere to all the rules of poetry and stuff, it gives you the date of the inscription. This is quite a skill and an art. So when he left Istanbul on his pilgrimage in 1671, it was for the last time. He based himself in Cairo and never returned to the capital. He doesn't tell us why. The last identifiable event he relates is in 1687. So we have some sort of date for how long he must have lived. So if we turn to the Seyahatname itself, its form has variously been described as a travelogue, an autobiography, a history, a geography. And exclusivists argue for any of these, but in fact the work is far more than the sum of its parts, as I hope I will show you. Coming to content, Evliya relates his reasons for writing the book. He tells us he wants to describe the Ottoman lands in full. He wants to provide a complete account of his travels, and he wants to relate the past and make it known. He also tells us his father proposed that he write down his travels and gave him the title for the work that would result. As for we, the readers, the doyen of Ottoman studies, of Evliya studies, Robert Dankov, who's one of the co-authors or the main author of the Eland volume, whose latest book is a study of Evliya's Nile journeys, it's just being published next month, characterizes his work thus. I won't read it out, but you can see this is a very sort of documentary approach. These are the characteristic units of the work. So for every place he goes, if it's of any size, he'll give you information about all these things. But integrated into this wealth of documentary information, there is anecdote, humor, adventure, and myth, and more. The work is quite unlike any other in the Ottoman canon. So the first 2 of Evliya's 10 volumes deal with Istanbul in all its variety. The last 2 recount his 1671 pilgrimage, his subsequent life in Africa, and his travels up the Nile. The 6 volumes in between, he narrates the rest of his journeys. Far-flung they were indeed. And if we wonder what impelled him to travel, which, I mean, there's no one else in Ottoman, in the Ottoman canon has written anything vaguely resembling it. Maybe people did travel, of course. Pashas were sent off to jobs in, to business, conduct state business at the edges of the empire. There were merchants, there were cadis, there were all sorts of people were traveling all the time. But he was certainly in a different class from them. So what he does, he tells us, is that his strolls around Istanbul in his youth awakened this desire in him to travel, and then this desire was sort of bolstered by his chats with dervishes who had wandered the world, and they told him what they had seen. But of course, he could not just decide to travel, and famously, the Seyahatname begins with a dream. Now, this dream is about, he falls asleep and he imagines that he's in a mosque, which is a named mosque, a known mosque, down on the Golden Horn, Evliya Çelebi, and he finds himself in the presence of the Prophet Muhammad, who eventually, there's a lot of description of the scene, but the essence of it is that he's called before Muhammad and he asks him what he wants, and Evliya says, tijaret, ziyaret, and seyahat. He actually means shefat, which means intercession. So this is, by introducing this play on words, he gives himself a justification for being able to set out on his travels. So there's another wordy slide coming up, but anyway, you can read it at your leisure. The world came to know about Evliya's Seyahatname and its author by a very tortuous route. It was written in Cairo, we think, and the history of how it became into the public realm is very different from manuscripts that were written in Istanbul, say. Until this note in a 1745 copy of one of the volumes was revealed, the story of how the work reached Istanbul was obscure. Here we read it was brought from Cairo in 1742 as a present to one of the major figures of the so-called, as we have to say now, we can't say tulip era as historians, we have to say the so-called tulip era, because we don't think it's that straightforward. This Haji Bashir Aga, who was the chief black eunuch to Ahmed III, Sultan Ahmed III, and his boon companion, just as Evliya had been to Murad IV. Out of the 10 volumes, only 8 are extant, and there are several manuscripts of the work of various dates and completeness. So essentially, it was in a cupboard in Cairo for 50 years, and then it reached Istanbul. I mean, it could have got lost on the way. Can you imagine? That would have just been terrible. We would never have known about this. But happily, it arrived safely, and we do. That's just a rather washed-out photo of a page from the manuscript. The red are sort of things that are particularly of note or important, or chapter headings. You'll see here this derkenar, this marginal note. The work is replete with these. Exactly how he wrote it, how he set it down on paper in the final copy is not definitely known. There are various sort of suggestions from scholars. But clearly he forgot things the first time round, and they were added in later. So there's a lot of that sort of thing throughout the work. So the first time that it sort of was taken notice of was by the Austrian diplomat and scholar Joseph Hammer von Purgstall, whose Ottoman history was a sort of classic that we used in the old days. 10 small volume green volumes in German, I remember them well, who found 4 books in Istanbul when he was working there in the embassy and translated part of it into English. Now, Hammer's translation of the first part of the Istanbul part, you may have seen it, it's been around a long time, and it was recently reissued by the Royal Asiatic Society. The operation of the translation gave huge headaches to the men of the Oriental Translation Society, who were responsible for bringing this, completing this work, because Hammer made a lot of mistakes and was extremely careless. And in fact, actually, I wrote an article about that, because it's a fascinating story. I mean, there was such rivalry amongst the Orientalists at that time, in the early 19th century, and he was being, slagged off by certain French Orientalists, and he was responding at great length and so on. It's a good story. After that, in the mid-19th century, there was extracts on Istanbul were published in Cairo and at Bulak in Cairo and in Istanbul. And in the late 19th century, the copy of the Seyahatname from one of the first two 1740s copies was begun in a cold, very cold stone library in what is now Çiçekçi in Istanbul, up on the hill in Üsküdar. So we have the personal account of one of the copyists who complains about the appalling conditions in which he worked, the cold primarily. But he also describes the bowdlerization the text underwent from fear of the ever-vigilant spies of Sultan Abdul Hamid. You must know him from the late 19th century. For instance, potentially offensive passages, which the guys in charge, the editors, I suppose, thought might be offensive or cause them trouble, were snipped out carefully and put in a cupboard for later use, or to be reintroduced into the text later. Well, it seems they never were, because that bowdlerized and highly defective version of Evliya's text was all that scholars had to use until the 1990s. When happily, Yapi Kredi produced an academic transcription, a modern Turkish version. There had been ones in the past, but this one was based on this transcription and by one of the same authors. Then a corrected 2-volume version came out in 2011, and now at last, we have the facsimile in a printed version. Not to have the facsimile for scholars is a very frustrating thing. Right. Now, Evliya and other travellers, in the contemporary preface to this bowdlerized version of his Seyahatname, Evliya is compared by the writers to Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta and considered superior. Marco Polo, as we know, travelled in 1271 to 1295 to China, and Ibn Battuta in 1325 to 54 to most of the Islamic world, as well as Africa, Asia, China. The reasons they complained about these Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta and did not find them the equal of Evliya was because Marco Polo only went east, so his travels were of less interest, and Ibn Battuta's account was said to lack historical and geographical information. Another famous name, which may be more familiar to those of you who are archaeologists and classicists, that can be included in a discussion of the texts of these great travellers is, like Evliya, another Anatolian boy, Herodotus, who was born, as you know, in Halikarnassus, Bodrum, in the 5th century. He travelled in Egypt and up the Nile and to the Black Sea steppe and in Anatolia. And the travellers of past times in all cultures were reprimanded for various sins: fabrication, exaggeration, plagiarism, mixing history and myth, both by critics in their own day and until our own. Some were accused of not actually having been where they went, of course. Frances Wood's book, Did Marco Polo Go to China?, obviously answers the question in the negative. It's a good read. She may have changed her opinion then, but I don't know about that. More recently, the BIAA's own Andrew Peacock wrote an article where he says that the further up the Nile Evliya went, the more fantastical his account became. So the implication, I think, is clear there, too. Okay, I hope this is the last words, I hope. It's wordy ones. Now, in his book on how Europeans took possession of the New World, the American literary scholar Stephen Greenblatt has perhaps surprisingly given his subject matter, which is about the New World, a lot to say about Herodotus. So this link, New World, Herodotus, Evliya. And the biggest surprise is the parallels with Evliya, both in the reception of their respective works and in the mentality informing them. So, yes, this is sort of standardish stuff about what travellers do and why they're there. Anyway, Evliya's studies, until recently, have been very positivist and narrowly conceived, looking at the Seyahatname as a documentary account of facts on the ground, as Evliya purported to have witnessed them. In some, his account is criticised when he departs from the expectations that modern readers have themselves imposed upon his text. So here we'll look at some of the things that critics object to. Topping the list are the apparent exaggeration and invention that give the Seyahatname so much of its appeal. An appreciation of these and the other non-documentary aspects of the work allowed us to read it with an open mind, rather than dismissing much of what Evliya writes as of no merit or relevance. I guess I've spoken about books that people haven't read before, but you're not getting a lot of Evliya himself. I'm sorry about this. I will be quoting one passage later, which is not entirely representative, but will give you some sense of it. So, hang on a second. So returning to his narrative strategies. So today, selfies, instant photography, we forget that conveying a sense of place visually is a relatively recent phenomenon. Before the days of photography, travellers might sketch or paint if they had the talent, but for the overwhelming majority, words were the only medium by which they could communicate with their readers. Now, if we turn to exaggeration, Robert Dankoff gives a list of Evliya's exaggerated numbers that include the round figure of 60. So this is just one example about many. 160 wrestling maneuvers, 160 cities along the Nile, 360 kinds of torture inflicted by the Safavids. Well, of course, in the 17th century, they weren't very popular with the Ottomans. 1,960 churches on sukkahs, kiosks. 7,060 taverns in Istanbul. We all do it. We say hundreds of this and thousands of that. But this is one of the sins of Evliya in the eyes of those who read him in a very positivist fashion. Invented travels, both places close to his route and further away. One of my colleagues, Pierre Mackay, has investigated his travels in northern Greece, trying to compare it with what was feasible in Evliya's day. Most egregiously, Evliya writes quite a short passage that he went to Holland and to Amsterdam, and he describes Holland and Amsterdam. Well, he didn't go there. Scholars, I think, can be certain about that. But for completeness, and in line with the expectation of his readers, he writes about it. Information he could have got from merchants, perhaps. It's not exactly, it's not obviously not completely made up. There are things in there that are perfectly rational. Now, this is an interesting one. Comparison with the familiar. How to say what something is like, in the words of Robert Macfarlane, when it is like nothing your reader has ever seen. So, describing for his readers the sights that he saw was not only his problem. Writers in other cultures had to wrestle with the same conundrum. So this is John Dennis, who's Evliya's near contemporary. And he is having a lot of trouble trying to describe a mountain for his readers back home. In another reference to mountains, the British colonial administrator William Burnet in 1708, so he's found a way to describe mountains. He likens the ice heaps of the Grunewald Glacier in Switzerland to the then almost completed St. Paul's Church, a site his London audience would have known well. Evliya employs this strategy to effect, and I'll try not to get carried away about these because, but they're really quite funny. So when he's in the northern Black Sea, he sees 8 pigs as large as Merziphon donkeys. Merziphon, the town in Anatolia, of course. He describes the lions of the northern Black Sea steppe as having a flowing coat like that of the mohair goat of Ankara. This is one I like very much. He travels when he goes up to the Sea of Azov and he goes onto the Kazan steppe. He has to cross over the Taman Peninsula, over the Taman crossing back to Crimea. And he conjures up the image of 20 men spinning on ice floes like Mevlevi dervishes in the current of the half-frozen sea. Again, it's another passage that's extremely vivid of the dangers and horrors of this crossing with all this ice everywhere. Perhaps the most eloquent example is his description of the Habsburg Emperor Leopold, with whom he had an audience in 1665 when he went on this peace mission. Okay, I'll try and read this quickly. So God made his skull in the shape of the bonnet of a Mevlevi dervish, or a gourd, or a water bottle. His eyes are as round as an owl and reddish. His face is long as that of Mr. Fox. His ears are as large as a child's slippers. Unfortunately, you can't see his ears there, but his nose is as a shriveled grape, or as large and red as an aubergine of the Peloponnese. His teeth are likewise huge white camel's teeth. His fingers are like cucumbers of Langa, which is a market garden in Istanbul. So all these objects that he conjures up in this word portrait would have been familiar to his readers. And in the previous section I talked about, I mean, the donkeys of Merziphon, the cucumbers of Langa, the Peloponnesian aubergines. So, and despite the recently bad relations between the Sultan and the Emperor, this is an almost humorous and almost an affectionate portrait. So I think the Patriarch of Mount Sinai appears to have been right in describing him as honorable and a man of peace. Another strategy is telling tales that conceivably might be true. These may have been examples of tales that were current when he traveled, and even if they were not current when he traveled, he knew that they would resonate in some way with his audience, his readership. So in 1671 again, he goes to Kütahya, we were there on our ride, and he tells the story about how there was sounds crazy, a struggle between the townspeople and the garrison over who got the liver, which was obviously much prized, the liver to eat, and the garrison, it was reserved for the garrison. The townspeople were not allowed to eat sheep's liver, koyunjeri. And he said that when he visited, there was a proverb in the town saying, fights are caused by liver. Now, what was the purpose of this story? We can only suggest, as I have done. He then goes to Afyon with its castle on top. He said he took 2 hours to walk up there, that he couldn't ride up because it was too steep, obviously, so he hitched up his skirts and up he went. Now there are steps, it's very easy. He says that because most of the people in the town were engaged in opium production, the men would not go home at night because the women were also addicts, and if there were 2 husband and wife in the same house, both addicts, then all sorts of troubles broke out, arguments and so on. So that's his story about Afyon. And then we come to Gediz, where there's this rather alarming rock formation, and he tells us that the stars of the tight-roping world gathered here every 20 or 30 years to perform the feat of crossing to one side or the other of the craggy valley below the town, and inevitably some of them fell. So this is what we saw, and we read what he wrote. So we were amused and we were interested. It added a lot to our jollity on our trip. Dreams, of course, an important genre in Western and Islamic literature, and the Seyahatname, as I said, begins with a dream. We might also remember that the founding myth of the Ottoman Empire is a dream, about a tree spreading over, a fertile landscape. He also records mundane dreams. Sometimes he has dreams, others dreaming on his behalf. Essentially, these dreams, as the dream I told you about at the beginning, are sort of predictive, and they give permission for him to take certain critical decisions in his life that he wouldn't otherwise, presumably, have been able to take. Right, now we're coming to the Evliya Çelebi way and its logo. So I'm a latecomer amongst Evliya aficionados, but with my co-conspirators Mac and Donna, who sadly aren't here, we decided to adopt the novel approach to Evliya studies in order to gain a wider understanding and a deeper understanding of him and his world. Now, it's important to note we would not have been able to take even the first steps without the extraordinary horses of our Cappadocian horseman, Ercihan Dilari, a man who we met thanks to the support and interest of Patricia Daunt, who insisted that there was no one else who could make our dream a reality. And you were at the start of it, Patricia. You really were. We went to various other horse people around the place, and or else they said yes, but we knew they wouldn't. We went to Ercihan, and he said yes, and it was all done, thanks to Patricia. So thus it was that in September 2009, we set out to ride the early stages of his pilgrimage route. He travelled by horse, we did too. We hoped that by reenacting some part of his travels, and in some fashion, there would be at least a degree of correspondence to his experiences, and we hoped to gain a better perspective on matters than a purely desk-bound researcher could acquire. How am I doing for time? You talked for about 10 minutes, so I think I've got a bit longer. So a fuller evaluation of what we learnt is the subject of another talk, but we learnt some very basic things that would not have occurred to us otherwise. We learnt that there are no shortcuts when you travel by horse. On foot too, I suppose, and I'd rather be on a horse than on foot when you're in the wrong place. You're hostage to every type of weather with no refuge. We also learnt that you have to traverse every sort of terrain. You may try and find shortcuts, but it doesn't really work out. So you just have to deal with everything. Evliya complains about the weather, the hararet of the sun, the heat of the summer, the great heat in summer, or the great cold, as in when he crossed over on these ice floes. But he seems to have taken the terrain in his stride, which horses fit for long-distance riding are able to do, even if you sometimes have to get off and walk, as he did in Afyon when he scaled the castle. We learned also that when you travel day in and day out, and this is relevant to how he might have set down his words on paper, whether he carried all his notes with him every time he went somewhere else, we don't really know, that it's very hard to remember the order of the villages that you've mentioned, that you visited even the same day. And it's harder still to find time in the evening, when your circumstances may not be entirely comfortable, to write up what has happened to you during the day. Notably, perhaps, we gained a very intimate knowledge of the towns and cities of northwest Anatolia. We rode in some of them. Where did we ride? We rode in Kütahya. We rode in Afyon, going through the city. And it's particularly an intimate knowledge of the countryside through which we have ridden and walked repeatedly since. So it's villages with their surprisingly varied and very individual histories, both from earlier times and when some of them were refounded or founded in the 19th century as a result of the shrinking of the empire. It's farmers and farming practices. It's shrines and sacred places and how they're being reimagined today. And particularly its ever-varying landscape and the terrible environmental degradation being wreaked upon it, so much of it today. So here I'll take you swiftly along our route to give you a flavour of the joys of travel in Evliya's hoofprints and show you a few of the places he wrote about that we visited. So thanks to Evliya, we could, like him, as Greenblatt has it, view the ordinary and everyday in a revealing new light. The perhaps rather undramatic landscapes of northwest Anatolia, where tourists are rarely seen, I mean, they go to Bursa, they go to Iznik, but you never see one in between, became re-enchanted for us when seen through Evliya's eyes. Okay, so what's first? Okay, so this is an attempt at a map of Evliya's journeys in Anatolia by a German scholar. It's confusing, and it's only Anatolia. Of course, as he went further out, it fanned out because he had to cross Anatolia repeatedly to get where he was going. Now, what we did, we followed his last journey, which goes down here. And remember, he's going on pilgrimage over here. Well, most pilgrims took the easy route, the sort of straight route, but not him. He hadn't seen this area before because his other journeys had all been in different parts of the country. And since he was trying to make a complete compendium of Ottoman history and of the Ottoman lands, and he was an Anatolia at heart, from Kütahya, and very much when he writes about Anatolia, you very much feel this affection he has for the land. This is the way he went. I'm sorry, these slides are a bit not very good. This is a map that's in our book. There's a route through Iznik and Yenişehir, İnegöl, Kütahya, Afyon, Uşak, Simav, and after 6 weeks, that's as far as we got. It was November, there was snow on the hills, and we were getting a bit cold. So we stopped. To be continued. Just comparing the two, the places, here are the places we went. We didn't go to Tavşanlı here, because, as he did, because there's a lot of quarrying there, and it didn't seem like a very pleasant place to go, so we varied the route a bit. I mean, if you're going to make cultural routes, they have to be places people want to go. You can't just make a route very faithful, or as faithful as you can be, given that you don't know exactly where he went, to someone's trip. And then, people get there and they say, I'd rather be somewhere else because there's a big highway or something. So this is how we did it. This is at the start of the route. This is our little plaque. We haven't got one at the end because we haven't reached the end yet. And this is the start. Now, there's this bridge, the Osman Gazi Bridge, and at that point is this peninsula. This is the shortest way across the Izmit Strait, and it was used in Byzantine, probably in Rome, and certainly in Ottoman times, both by merchants and by, high-ups, by senior figures, statesmen of various sorts. And the bridge comes here and just sort of goes like that. So it actually sort of leaves the village ahead alone. And this is the site of the city that Constantine built for his mother, Helenopolis. So it's a very interesting site, now covered by a marshy lake. They don't really care about the Byzantine side of it. And there's a nice big statue of Osman Gazi outside the coffee house. Poor Evliya. The mayor does want to put an Evliya statue up there, and he thinks our project's wonderful, and he's got brochures about us, but it hasn't happened yet. Hersek, it's called Hersek, and this is the mosque of the founder, Hersek, well, not the founder, but I mean the Ottoman refounder, Hersek Zadeh Ahmed Pasha, who was from Herzegovina. He was an aristocrat, and he was a grand vizier under 3 sultans, under Mehmet, under Fatih, under Bayezid, and under Selim I. So that's the start of our... And then this is the joys of riding. The river Drakon, which classicists will know, flows down towards, flows to the sea from close to Lake Iznik. He goes past Çoban Kale, which is a Byzantine hill fort that the Ottomans then took over. He describes it as a halting place for shepherds, a lair for robbers, and a trap for merchants. It commands the view south from, and the Drakon flows below to the Yalak as it is today. This bridge he never saw because it was built again over the Drakon, built by the mother of Ahmed III in the early 18th century. It's still a very beautiful structure, which is why I show you it. You can also see the countryside through which we rode. Here we are in Iznik. There's Ercihan on his trusty Anadolu, who is not riding anymore, and there we're sort of lurking at the back, so we went through Iznik. Here, you probably know Girit, Turkish sport Girit. This is the other, apart from archery, of course, the other Turkish sport, and it's called Rahvan. It's a pacing race. You can see that the legs of the horse on the same side are together, so it's like pacing rather than if normal trotting. It's the diagonal legs that are together. Done by farmers, by cooks in restaurants, people with very, very little money. So when you go, you're only allowed to break this pace. You have to keep the pace. You can't suddenly start cantering or galloping. They have to keep the pace. So if you break the pace 3 times, I can't feel thrown out on the 3rd or the 4th, they yell out the umpire up in his eyrie, and he says, "You're running like a dog," or "Don't run like a dog, köpekleme." So, and they all try and then go back to doing this Rahvan. It's a lot of fun. And it's done all over the west of Turkey and various other places as well. But they're just, guys. It's quite interesting. Now, this is a modern, how one of the shrines that we went to has been reimagined. There seems to be a bit of a wave at the moment to reimagine a lot of the shrines, which women used to go to, men didn't go too much, shrines of saints, Evliya mentions a lot in the Seyahatname, as sort of, proper Sunni places. And women are encouraged to go to them. There's a particularly egregious example of the reimagining of one of them at Baba Sultan, east of Bursa, where there used to be antlers hanging from above the shrine of the saint. And they're a bit iffy. They're not really, very sort of Sunni. So last time I went, we asked the Mukhtar where they'd gone, and he said, they've gone off somewhere, taken them away. Anyway, they sort of now greatly expanded this place. Busloads of people come, and it's sort of become more Sunni in people's minds than it used to be. And this is another that's now been done up, Selim Baba, who Evliya obviously was very impressed by this place. So I'll just tell you what. That's right. He says that when it's outside a town called Çukurca near Domaniç, and he says that when the acolytes went up to the Yaila, to the summer pasture, they left everything behind and nobody touched it. So sacred was this saint. You could just leave anything and no one would come and steal it. So he thought it was particularly sacred. Here, just to show you that's actually a Roman road near Uşak, but these are typical sort of, old Ottoman cobbled roads. And there's quite a lot of that. I mean, most of them obviously have been destroyed, but it's very exciting when we find one. This is Yoncala. Yoncala is a place near Kütahya where there are famous hot springs. This is a mosque from 1233, of which Selçuk is it? It's a Selçuk mosque, Alaaddin Keykubad. And this is the hammam, which Scott kindly deciphered from a rather bad photo, and there was still one cracks in it. Now, they did it all up, and they were going to let it, as I was there 2 weeks ago, let it as a sort of, cultural centre, and now I think it's going to be the hammam again, but it doesn't look anything like it did when I was there when was that? 2010. So, there's the Selçuks, far to the west. Here, this is in Kütahya. Now, this is the Kapan Han. They call it something else now, but actually there's not much of a Han left anymore. There's a monumental gateway, and if you go inside, there's like more than one car. It's a sort of car park. And you wouldn't have any idea of the grandeur that you would, of how grand it had been in Evliya's day. But here he quotes the inscription in his Seyahatname, and he does that quite a lot when he sees inscriptions. And it is indeed the same inscription that is still over the door there. Now, Scott was going to provide a mellifluous translation, but somehow failed to, and I won't try because you're going here, never mind. But the interesting thing about this is, just to show you, so these presumably, I don't know if it's the whole of the last line or the end of the last line, when you add up the letters with the values which are given to them in the Arabic alphabet, you arrive at 912, which is the Hijri year, the Islamic year. So this is Evliya composed this inscription, and here it is. Did he compose it? No, he didn't. He wasn't there then. Sorry. He saw it. But that's the sort of thing he did elsewhere. He composed chronograms. Okay. And this is a place called Altuntaş, where there's a Roman bridge, and there's a mosque on which is an inscription from 1237 referring to the bridge, so it may be the repair inscription from the bridge at some point. The mosque itself is old, I think, Selçuk. When we were reading before we went, we read a lot of other travelers who had taken this route in past times, and we discovered that many 19th century and late 18th century travelers had been across the plain south of Kütahya. And this is the fountain in one of the villages. Well, unfortunately, I don't know how much of this is left now, because they built an airport, Zafer Airport, between Uşak, Kütahya, and Afyon to try and if you come from outside, it's pretty horrible having to get there, because if you're on business, you don't really want to go by bus. So now you can fly probably directly from Istanbul and Ankara. So I haven't actually been on this stretch since, but a lot of it will now have been that wonderful riding country where Patricia was with us, will not be as it was. Okay, now yes, people who haven't read Evliya, I'm coming to the end now, just almost, who haven't read Evliya. So we came to a town before Uşak, east of Uşak, called Uçbaş. And they have this product which has a sigil, it's certified, it's patented. And the Mukhtar, all the Mukhtars were delighted to see us when we arrived in these places. So much more friendly than coming in a 4x4. Actually, some of them did try and drive us away. I mustn't remember it all in a rosy glow. We did have some altercations. They would come in the night, some of them, with the gendarme, and it was usually me who had to get out of my warm sleeping bag at 11 o'clock because I was the only foreigner who spoke both languages. But anyway, so they got this garlic, and they say, oh yes, Evliya, in his Seyahatname, says that the garlic of Uçbaş is famous. So I asked some experts on Evliya, and they didn't remember anything about this. I couldn't see it in the actual passage in the Seyahatname where it says that there were shops of blacksmiths in Uçbaş. Nothing about garlic. But now it's become digitally searchable, the text, and this is a complete fabrication. But anyway, it's wonderful. It doesn't say anything about Evliya on it, which is odd, since they were so, this was their selling point to us. But anyway, that's the garlic that Evliya mentions in Uçbaş. Okay, and there's the book, and there's the book in Turkish, and there's... Last year we were involved in an EU project, which we hope is ongoing, to create you'll like this, a unbroken hiking route, riding route too perhaps, from Canterbury to Demre. So this is the İnegöl. Our partner on the Evliya Çelebi Way was İnegöl Belediyesi, so I worked with them a lot and redid the route in İnegöl, which is 85 kilometers. It has to be in Turkish because it's an EU project, and it has to be in Turkish, though there is an English version too somewhere. Right, now, so yeah, that project is what we're hoping to call it the Via Eurasia, which we have even had the cheek to put the name on this book. We have Italian partners, and we haven't discussed it with them yet, but we thought we'd do a land grab before anyone else decided to. So that's that. Now, the other most famous horse sport, equestrian sport, is jirit, where you throw that stick at it's two teams. He's got a stick in his hand, a baton, and you throw it at the other guys. I think it's meant to hit them between their neck and somewhere down here. So it's quite vicious, and these horses were huge, great, stocky, enormous things. I didn't dare get on them, others did. I wasn't that brave. So Evliya was clearly a competent horseman, but he was also a jirit player. But some of his fellow players were obviously less competent than him. So he writes that he lost 4 teeth playing jirit with a high official called Defterzade Ahmed Pasha. And as an apology, he received a horse and a purse of gold. And as if this was not bad enough, some years later, he writes that he lost 3 teeth when playing jirit with a different pasha in Hungary. So here again, we have an example of his wish to engage and to entertain us. Did he really lose 7 teeth? Did he forget the circumstances under which he lost his teeth? Can we know? Does it matter? Does it detract from our pleasure in reading the Seyahatname if we suspect some exaggeration or some invention? So I will just conclude thus. So horses can make you a bit soppy, as we know, all of us who have the wonderful happiness to be around horses now and then, and especially when we contemplate that without them a life on the road would be inconceivable. So Donna Landry reminded me recently of how Evliya speaks of his horse, Hamis, when on campaign with the Ottoman army in Hungary. He actually was a warrior and fought in battles. He describes his Hamis thus: noble as an Arab thoroughbred, dearer to me than my own brother, my soul's companion, my zephyr-swift steed Hamis. So I'll finish with this quotation from the 10th century Arab poet al-Mutanabi that sums up Evliya's world and what it meant to us as we followed in his footsteps. It seems to express the place where we found ourselves, somehow poised between the horses that made our reenactment possible and the Seyahatname that was our roadmap. So I think Evliya would have agreed with what Mutanabi has to say about the horse and the book, which are the two sort of essentials of Evliya's life and work. Thank you very much.
Very much. Caroline has been kind enough to offer to take some questions from the audience, and so here you go.
So I forgot that there is, in Uşak, there's a team of lady jirit players. I forgot about her. I put her in there. We saw it.
Thanks so much for the really interesting talk. I just wondered, you spoke a lot about Evliya's audience and the fact that he's writing for an audience. If the book is so long, it was left in Cairo, how can we reconstruct what he thought about that audience and how he thought people would end up reading the book?
We can't. We can only infer from the way he writes. No, we can't. It's difficult or impossible. It's obviously a good question, and such questions are very important these days. But he seems to have been someone who was, from the way he writes, cognizant of, what he was doing. He wasn't just writing; otherwise, it would have been bland and boring. He obviously wrote with certain intentions of affecting people in certain ways. So it's all by inference, but there's nothing more than that. Sorry, it's not much of an answer, but it's the best answer I can give.
Excuse me. How does his account relate to other Ottoman literature? Is it unique?
Well, it's unique. It is. I mean, you know, there are those who try and compare it with other texts, but it doesn't easily fall into any of the sort of typical genres. I mean, there are other travelers, but they are nothing on the scale of this. I mean, I'm not a literature person, but, you know, so I can't go into Yorgo, you know about this stuff, into the fine details of this. I mean, for me as a historian, it is, and I've read many chronicles, and, you know, obviously there are other religious works and so on, different genres. It's unique. I don't know how to describe it more precisely within that context.
There is other travel literature in...
There is, but it's not. Most of it's later. There's a sort of, you know, maritime accounts, one or two, but that's a different thing in itself. I mean, it's not like being on land where you have different sorts of adventures on the sea. And most of it's later, and you should read the Eland book. You'll see how he writes and the pleasure with which he writes and the pleasure that the readers can get from it. A lot of the other texts are a bit dry.
Yes. Questions?
Did he refer to the origins of the Ottoman Empire in his writings? The origins of the Ottoman Empire?
What about them?
The origins of the Ottoman Empire, the origins.
Yes.
Did he refer to this at all?
Oh, does he? No, he talks quite a lot about that, yeah.
Because just one thing, I've got some
Don't
questions.
ask me what he says.
I understand the Mongol Empire. The Ottomans moved from Central Asia to the Anatolian plateau because of the Mongol Empire.
Yeah.
Is that true? And did he refer to that at all?
He writes a lot about history in bits and pieces here and there. He's obviously very aware of it. He's very interested in it. He does write about it in sort of, you know, compact sort of sections here and there, but a lot of it's split up with, you know, and attached to the descriptions of the places he visits. In Istanbul, he has long sections on the founding of Istanbul as he understands it. So.
Perhaps one last question?
No more questions.
Great. So thank you again very much, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thanks,